do feel free to send Tony a message in the chat box. Or since you're all Foresight companies, on our Slack channel. Many of you here may know Amanda. Amanda Lowe is our new Prairies program manager as well. If you have not had the chance to meet her, she's a fantastic part of the team. Quick housekeeping issues. We will be recording today's session. So if you're uncomfortable with that, now would be the time to leave. I think it's a wonderful chance for us to capture some of the thoughts and ideas and concepts here, as well as some of your questions for our panelists, and share them with those who weren't able to make it live. So Tony, are we recording?
Good to go.
Fantastic. Other than that, I always encourage you to jump in the chat box and write down any questions you have as they come. We will store those for later, and we will ask those of the panelists, but we don't want you forgetting about those things and then drifting off into the ether and then us not getting something important answered for you. So do take advantage of that. Moving on, I'll let you know what we're hoping to do here. I always ramble for the first couple minutes of any presentation. You guys have all probably sat through some of my the programs. I apologize for that. I'll try to make it as painless as possible. Do some introductions for our panelists. Get down to that presentation we talked about. A little bit of a discussion. I've got some questions. Hopefully you guys have some questions and we can get you the answers you need. Make sense? All right, I see some thumbs up and some nodding. That's good. Okay. The audio is working.
Thanks, Khalil. Thanks, Catherine.
I would like to do a territorial acknowledgement. So I am presenting from the territorial, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. This includes the Stolo, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. I think this is very apropos for today's discussion of obviously environmental, social, and governance issues, but also as well to the mission that Foresight has. Indigenous peoples have lived in harmony with nature for thousands of years, and that's certainly something that Foresight is trying to get us back to, a sustainable circular economy where we're not damaging the natural world. So very, very happy to be looking and the hard work that all of you people are doing to come up with the solutions that will lead us there. Now, in terms of our panelists, you guys have been waiting. The excitement has been killing you, I can tell. We have Sara Blankhorn, the founder of the Leverage Lab. Thank you, Sara. Sara will introduce herself a little bit later. She's also leading the presentation, along with Juvarya Veldkamp, who is the director at Canada Climate Law Initiative. She'll tell you a little bit more about that. We also have Elise Crouston from Risa Capital. She's the Director of Investor Relations. Risa Capital is an impact investment group, and I will give Elise the chance to share a little bit more about them now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Yeah, and thanks for that little tidbit about Risa. Yes, we're a BC-focused impact investment firm. The first screen for our portfolio strategy is looking for private companies that are aligning themselves and working towards one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Risa, we think of ourselves as a financial intermediary beyond just an impact investment fund. So certainly in our work, we have funds under management that leverage the venture capital tax incentive. So we invest in BC-based companies and then are able to extend a 30% tax credit to our investors. But parallel to that, and we have two other realms of work. One is ecosystem building. So we were formed on the Sunshine Coast, and we work within our rural or remote geographies across BC and in the Yukon to build place-based impact funds that are focused on keeping entrepreneurship in place and and funding clean tech and tech opportunities in geographies that are traditionally focused on resource extraction. And then finally, we're partially owned by the Sunshine Coast Credit Union. So we work within the traditional banking sector to create SDG-linked impact banking products, like a GIC that is leveraged into debt, into clean tech, or even just like social entrepreneurship, community-focused businesses. And so this is all kind of part of our strategy to democratize impact investing, to allow your normal individual to be able to participate in an economy that is purpose-driven, values-aligned, strives for equity and reconciliation, but also primarily is pushing us towards a more sustainable energy future. And I know Sara from my work, my privilege working within Hollyhock and Rise as a B Corp. And so we do a lot of work together in the B Corp movement. And I've also had the privilege to work with a few other B Corp impact firms in Vancouver, including renewal funds and active impact investments. And so happy to speak to kind of the B Corp movement more specifically as well. Thanks for having me.
Great, Elise. Thank you so much. And I'm glad that that happened at the beginning of the recording, because I'm going to go back and steal your little spiel about the aligned with the different values and the outcomes and the reconciliation. And that was a wonderful little paragraph you had on that. And I might borrow that from you if it's all right.
Thank you. I hope to borrow it for myself if it was good.
All right, without any further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Sara and Juvarya.
Thanks so much, Stephen, for that wonderful introduction. It is lovely to be here, and thank you all for joining us today. It's great to have some time with you all to talk about this really important subject matter. So I'm going to share my screen with you all, and then I'll project the presentation, and Juvarya and I are going to take turns to walk you through it. So just give me one sec here. Can you all see my screen?
Go.
Yes? Great, thumbs up, thank you. So yeah, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about environmental, social, and corporate governance. And before we do that, I just, like Stephen said, we're going to give you a bit of an introduction, much like Elise did to her for herself. So I'll start. My name is Sara Blinkhorn. I am the director at Leverage Lab. And at Leverage Lab, we're deep into systems change experts, and we help organizations and companies prepare and build strategies for a changing world. A big part of that work that we do is helping companies get B Corp certified. And we can talk about that a little bit more later. But a lot of it is built on my decade plus of experience in facilitation and working within the sustainability space. Just to give you a brief snapshot of my background, here are some of the organizations that I've had the pleasure of working with. You know, a lot of some of the pieces we're going to talk about today is based on the foundation of my master's of science that I got in leadership towards sustainability. And I'm going to pass it over to Juvarya to introduce herself and Canada Climate Law Initiative.
Oh, thank you, Sara. Hi, yes, I'm Juvarya Veldkamp. I'm director with the Canada Climate Law Initiative. We are part of a global effort. We're coordinated with the Commonwealth Climate Law Initiative out of the UK, with operations in Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, India, South Africa, and the US as well, again now. All around this idea that as climate change is here and poses significant material risks to businesses, what does that mean in terms of a director's duty? And so we provide not only research and the academic rigor around that, but we also work with a network of 70 experts in the field who help contribute to materials that we create, like guidances and toolkits for directors to help understand their role around this. And then about myself, I'm director here since August. We got funding to hire myself to scale up this program across Canada. Prior to this, for 10 years, I was with the City of Vancouver working on green economy initiatives and programs. Part of that was certainly mapping out the needs of clean tech stakeholders and designing programs to support the clean tech ecosystem, and working closely with our colleagues at Foresight So hopefully I've tried to adjust our comments that are CCLI legal governance comments and bring them in line with hopefully what's important as clean tech entrepreneurs in the clean tech investment landscape.
Thank you, Juvarya. So I thought we would start just with really understanding what sustainability is. You know, ESG is a framework. We're going to dive into the definition of that first, but first thinking about the larger umbrella of the word sustainability. And if you're feeling a little like all these words, it can be acronym soup, and it can be confusing. So we're going to just sort of walk you through some of these definitions to help give it context and meaning for you all. One of the definitions I love that's been around for ages is the one from the Brundtland World Commission, which is that sustainability is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now that's big and lofty, and it really does accurately describe what sustainability is. However, it doesn't tell you what to do on Monday morning. So it's not prescriptive in that respect. And due to the fact that we only have 30 minutes together here to give you an overview, I'm not going to go into a detailed scientific definition of sustainability. I like to use the 4 sustainability principles, but I will just plug that it's important, like playing any game, to understand the rules and what success means. And, you know, on this planet, we have a biosphere, we have a relatively closed system with respect to matter. For those of you who know the laws of thermodynamics, you'll know that nothing disappears and everything disperses, and that photosynthesis pays the bills. So those are some of the rules of the game in terms of science and the systemic boundaries that we have that we're working with. And I have 4 sustainability principles that at a later time, if you want to reach out to me, I can go into depth, but in interest of time, we're not going to go deep into those today. But what we do know is we have one finite planet that we're all inhabiting, and that population is increasing substantially. Today we have approximately 7.6 billion people, all trying to meet their needs as best they can. As you can see, the population has been growing exponentially and is projected by 2050 to be 9.1 billion. So the problem of population expansion on one finite planet, we will continue to have that. So the real question is, what are the consequences and impacts from global population of 7.6 billion people living on one finite planet? You know, I think we're starting to see some of those problems become very real as we're seeing climate change impacts, as well as even viruses plaguing the whole globe simultaneously. So the challenge is, how, given the current situation, do we manage and allocate today the Earth's resources for the survival of a projected population of 9 to 10 billion people by 2050, and for their offspring indefinitely? So there's some of the big world pictures painting the context without going into too much detail, just for the rest of the conversation today. So I wanted to define ESG as environmental, social, and corporate governance. 3 central factors used to measure a business's sustainability and social impact. So you might be thinking, oh gosh, okay, is another acronym. What's the difference between CSR and ESG? Is this another thing we need to learn? So I wanted to maybe answer that question for you. CSR has a long-term goal of establishing a good reputation with consumers, employees, and the community. And ESG also has a long-term goal, but through the lens of risk mitigation, particularly financial stability, financial stability. So thinking about how your company will deal with risk moving forward, and it's taking a look at that lens. So in the big picture of the sustainability piece, they're very much looking at that big challenge and question of how we maintain our resources and survive here on this planet indefinitely, but through different lenses. So why now? Why now as opposed to why not before? And I think we're in a really interesting space and time in the world where millennials are the biggest generation, and they're entering into the economy, and they're starting to vote with their dollars. They're voting with their jobs, and they're really wanting to work with companies who resonate with their values. And studies are saying that their values are around sustainability efforts. And so if a company, you're going to get brand loyalty with millennials, and recruitment of top talent and retention, because millennials are voting with their jobs and voting with their dollars increasingly. This is a resource that I think you could all go deeper into. It's by a mentor of mine by the name of Bob Willard. He's a 7-time author, but he has this business case for sustainability. So not only is investing your company into sustainability or a sustainability plan, not only does it make, is it the right thing to do, but it also makes dollars and cents. And so he has a spreadsheet you can find online where you type in your expenditures on these pieces and can get a number of what you can make and save. But ultimately, the average is that by investing in a sustainability strategy, your company can make and save 51 to 81% on its bottom line over 3 to 5 years. And you're going to see a lot of those savings in savings on reduced energy, reduced waste, as well as reduction of risks. And then, as I mentioned earlier, increased employee productivity. You'll be saving on retention. I think the stat is that it costs 3 to 5 times somebody's salary to replace them. So if you're hiring millennials and they're staying longer, your expenses on rehiring are going to go down. And why now? Now is the time. It's, as I was mentioning earlier, it's a really interesting time to be alive. It feels like the whole world is sort of woken up and had a moment to say, hey, wait a minute, what's happening? The coronavirus has allowed us to slow down, and people are becoming activists. People are marching in the streets. Investors are looking to work with businesses who prioritize ESG. I think somebody might be off mute. And then BlackRock, Larry Spinks requires companies he invests in to disclose a plan for how their business model might be compatible with a net zero economy. And I know we're going to say more about that a little bit later, but I think for now, I'm going to pass it off to Juvarya.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Sara. And it's a pleasure to be here. I guess you're going to be driving. So yes, you can go into the next slide for me, please.
Thank you.
So as Sara outlined, I guess ESG is about how we make decisions and what inputs we use when we're making decisions. In 2019, I remember reading a report. It came out from Microsoft, Google, MIT, and a few others. And they wrote, at the bottom line was that the technology to fight climate change has been available for years. We just haven't deployed it at scale yet. So to me, that says, okay, there's a sustainable pathway. We just keep not picking it. And this is a failure of decision making. What's exciting about ESG to me is that it is increasingly used now as a tool, primarily by investors, but we'll get into that, to change the way they make decisions. And I think this is in recognition of how We've seen companies that focus on the long term perform better. Companies that pay attention to stakeholder engagement gain a social license to operate. Companies that manage their GHGs, as Sara was saying, save money, and they innovate the new products and services of the future that we're going to need. And so we've got better over the last, I guess, 20, 30 years on measuring things like reputation, diversity, inclusion, health, and safety. And so now we can use these metrics in decision making. And I think that's what ESG is about. So since the 70s, with the rise of the financial sector, we replaced human values with financial value, as Mark Carney says. But ESG is a sign that we may be undoing that. And now we can maybe properly reflect social capital and human capital in decisions. And I think there's 4 drivers that I'll talk about for this shift in thinking in the financial system. And then at the end, I'll tie it together with some applications I hope are relevant to you as clean tech entrepreneurs. But first, I think this shift is just happening because of the challenges we face. As Sara highlighted in her comments, you know, governments, I used to work in government, City of Vancouver for 10 years. Governments around the world are thinking, how do we make livable cities? How do we feed the hungry? How do we get around and get goods and people around our cities without congestion? And this is reflected in government spending. Biden announced a $2 trillion climate plan. Europe has allocated 10 trillion euros to their decarbonization plan. Investors put 36 billion into clean tech solutions last year, and someone on this call might know if that's right or wrong, but that was the data I found. But you know, needless to say, this is a big opportunity, and so as this is the opportunity, the nature of the opportunity, investors want more tools to understand how do you evaluate these opportunities. The second reason, so second slide, please, Sara. The second reason I think ESG is becoming more important is this is a critical way to think about risk. So just zeroing in on climate change, that's where we at the Canada Climate Law Initiative spend sort of most of our time, but these are all related issues. Climate change is related to biodiversity collapse and to social equity, so they're all related. But zeroing in on climate change, it's here now already. So as Sara mentioned, we used to think about it as intergenerational and protecting future generations, protecting our children. Right now we're protecting our own homes and our livelihoods and our factories and our supply chains, because the physical impacts of climate change, the initial ones, are already here. Wildfires, floods, sea level rise. And so, you know, sustainability used to be thought of as this nice to have public benefit, but it was a cost center. I remember I worked for a real estate developer. We were trying to go green, and we went to the VP to engage him in this process, the VP of construction. And he said, sure, I'll build you a green building. Here's a 12% premium. We don't necessarily think like that anymore. We think of this total cost of ownership. Okay, you know, there are things that may be stripped away from that building. You don't need such a big mechanical system. Plus you have a longer term asset value and all the other things Sara mentioned. And so we made this business case for sustainability. But now with climate change arriving, it's even a step further, and it's about managing risk and protecting future cash flows. And I'll talk about the task force for climate related financial disclosures in a second, but they divide risk into this physical risk that I mentioned, but there's also a transition risk. And so if we are able to minimize the physical risk by doing something, then there's a transition risk. How will a carbon price impact your business model? Will you be exposed to legal liability? Will you be able to get insurance? And so central banks around the world have agreed that climate change poses a real threat to financial stability, and we must find a way to identify and quantify this risk. So enter TCFD, also the Network for Greening the Financial System. And this was a response to this, and TCFD has a recommended approach now for how companies and financial institutions should go about disclosing this risk. So there's a sort of graphic there that tells you how they divide it into these 4 parameters, governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics. But it's not easy. So when you're talking about metrics, you can't use past data to predict future values because the climate isn't the same anymore. It's not predictable. So this is where you hear about climate scenario analysis and the idea of using stochastic or probabilistic models to think about what the future scenarios might be, and then what strategies can you pick that could win in hopefully different scenarios. And the Bank of Canada and OSFI, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, they're piloting in Canada what are these climate scenarios, because in Canada we're warming actually twice as fast as the global average. We talk about the 3-degree warming, or, you know, the business as usual, we're heading for 3.3 or 4. But at the Paris guardrails for our climate are between 1.5 and 2 degrees. If we go outside of that, we have a totally different planet. The ice age was 4 degrees cooler than it is today. So that tells you about how much impact each of these degrees of change make. So slide 3, please, or the next slide. It's probably not 3 for you. So the first reason ESG is important, it's the nature of those investments that are available. It's secondly about risk. Third, and I alluded to this, and I think Elise will talk about this, but investors believe that ESG integration delivers value. They get a higher risk-adjusted long-term return from sustainable companies. Many models show. I think there is still some discussion about this. But responsible investments that have some form of ESG integration are a huge piece now, as Sara mentioned, millennials, as there's a transfer of wealth from the baby boomers to millennials to women. These values are very important. Also sort of faith-based investing also prioritizes ESG. So I think the number is that it's doubled in about 10 years, and there's over 3 trillion in assets under management now that are some form of ESG investing. You will hear in this area about ESG rankings and ratings. There are firms not listed on the slide, but like Sustainalytics, MSCI, Standard & Poor's, the FTSE, they all have approaches where they send surveys to companies and they collect a lot of ESG data. In fact, there's survey fatigue in some cases, but these companies collect ESG data and then they turn it into a score so that it's more manageable. And you'll hear about things like, you know, Tesla has a really high score with one ranking system, but a really low score with one ranking system because they're prioritizing different metrics in their eventual ranking. And you don't even have to report your ESG metrics. There are firms now like True Value, I believe. They use natural language processing and AI. So they're just scouring the internet. They're looking at to mine all the data from your press releases and your website and still create a score. So you know, maybe disclosure isn't even, I think disclosure is still relevant, but you know, things like this could make disclosure less important, and you're still going to have to worry about how investors now interpret this information. But ESG doesn't have to only be a tool for investors, and it can also be a tool to assess your own business strategy and performance. It matters though what you think is material. So as I said, those ESG rankings, they've got their algorithm for what they want to use in their ranking, but to really be a tool for business strategy and performance, you have to understand what's material, what issues are of critical importance to your stakeholders, what issues have a financial impact now or may very soon. There's this idea when you look at materiality, it can be double and dynamic. So it can be double in that it applies to environmental and social and financial, or it can be dynamic in the sense, well, it's environmentally and socially material now, but it's going to be financially material soon. And there's a lot of organizations that are helping create frameworks to identify what ESG issues are material. So for instance, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, they have mapped out ESG issues for different industry sectors because, you know, different industries may have different materiality issues. They have maps I checked yesterday for biofuels, forestry management, fuel cells, batteries, solar and wind technology, and the project developers, biotech, chemicals, and packaging. Hopefully that's a lot of the verticals that we're in and talking about today. On the other hand, at the end of last year, the World Economic Forum came out with universal ESG metrics. The idea here is that can we measure this stakeholder capitalism? What is valuable beyond the financial bottom line? And they've come up with a universal approach. And I think all of this reflects this move away. It's not Milton Friedman's doctrine anymore, that a company only exists to increase profits and we can measure it with all these different approaches. And I don't think I mentioned on here, but the UN Sustainable Development Goals is also a really critical tool that I think is interesting. We had the Millennium Development Goals before the millennial, but they were never really adopted by the corporate sector like the UN SDGs have been. And the corporate sector was really involved with development of the SDGs, and that may reflect why they've really wholeheartedly adopted them. So, you know, the idea, does our business purpose align with what we as a global society need? And that's how people are using the SDGs. So next slide, please. So at the Canada Climate Law Initiative, as I mentioned, we work with 70 experts across the country, and we meet with boards of directors at no cost and in a confidential setting to discuss how all of this relates to governance issues and directors' duties. And in Canada, the wording of the statutes and common law fiduciary obligations is very clear. There is a duty on directors to address climate change. Someone described it to me as, you no longer need to prove climate change when you walk into a court. In the same manner, you don't need to prove the sky is blue. And so regulators and investors recognize climate change as a risk, so you have an obligation to address it. The Canadian Securities Administrators and the Ontario Securities Commission both have staff notices on this, and they support climate-related financial disclosures. And I think the CSA staff notice cites TCFD as well, the TCFD recommendations. And an Ontario Securities Commission task force is recommending mandatory climate risk disclosure. So this could impact, I believe, you know, eventually also if you're listed on the Ventures exchange. And in the US under Biden may very well do the same. We had a lot of, you know, fanfare of amazing activities that the climate plan, Biden's climate plan includes. Maybe I'm saying amazing, maybe that's subjective, but one of the things that wasn't reported is that he had a directive establishing a working group that will look at quantifying the social cost of carbon. And this is also that they can better establish accountability. So that's a very important step for that administration. As far as disclosure goes, it is mandatory in many jurisdictions. In the EU, they've had a directive since 2014 about disclosing non-financial and diversity information. And in New Zealand, they've announced that they will require climate risk disclosure by 2023 on a disclose or comply or explain basis. So this means you must comply or explain why you haven't. And in the UK, it will be law by 2025. Even in Canada, you may have noticed that the large employer financing facility, so this was a COVID economic response, a wage subsidy for large employers, and you could only receive the funding if you agreed to start reporting on your climate risk. So it's not a matter of if, but when it's likely that there will be mandatory disclosure in Canada. I have 2 more slides. How am I doing for time, Sarah? I'm going to keep going. So to finance all this green and sustainable activity, we have a variety of tools. We talked a little bit about the investment side, and I'll let Elise talk about that. It's her expertise. There's also on the lending side, there are green bonds, which you will have heard of, that are, the interest rate is tied to specific green outcomes. But there's also sustainability bonds, social bonds that are tied to social outcomes, sustainability linked bonds, which are not about a sustainable outcome for the project, but are general sustainability outcomes for the organization. And there's sustainable development goal bonds, which are a World Bank instrument. So there's a lot of different instruments. The cumulative value of just green bonds to date is over $1 trillion. And so all of this begs the question, how do we define exactly what is green? And there's a lot of need for this so we can avoid greenwashing, allow better benchmarking. For green bonds, there is green bonds principles from the International Capital Markets Association. But even more interestingly, there is now a taxonomy around what is green. So there is one in China and there is one in the EU. So this establishes a common language and uniform criteria, kind of a screening criteria for what is green or sustainable activities. The EU one includes green and also transitional activities. And it's important to note that the transitional activities do not include natural gas. These are important because regardless of where you are, even non-EU funds might be asked to disclose the percentage of investments that are aligned with this EU taxonomy. As I mentioned, there's one in China as well. Singapore is establishing one. And given that natural gas is not included in the EU one and Canada's unique, I suppose, economic structure, there is a move to create a Canada taxonomy too. It was a little bit stalled, but I understand they will be announcing soon in this spring. There was a plan to have a brown taxonomy too, and this would outline what would be negative or excluded from ESG screening. It's not happening currently because there was a lot of, I guess, apprehension about such a taxonomy. So last slide, just trying to tie it together from your perspective as CEOs of clean tech companies. I think ESG considerations are important for you for three reasons. Well, two reasons, and one is climate governance, but two reasons that I think are important. It's on the minds of your customers and investors. So you should understand how to communicate your value to them using whatever ESG language or tools they do. And then the other is the market opportunity. So thinking about the market opportunity, one of the last things I did when I was still with the City of Vancouver was we looked at all the green building policies across the province, including the BC Energy Step Code and the Vancouver Zero Emissions Building Bylaw. And we mapped out what this is doing in terms of generating demand for heat recovery ventilators, heat pumps, high performance insulation, and 6 other categories of building products. I believe I saw Donovan Woolard on the call. We then worked with Shift to turn this into an app. So you can go on and see what is the demand for 75% efficient heat recovery ventilators in Vancouver between 2025 and 2030. And that, market opportunity is there, not just for green buildings, but in terms of all the policies that we mentioned earlier that government's putting in place to build the kind of world that we need. So green transportation and so on. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other graph there, I think the citation went, but there's about $500 billion in climate finance dedicated to the developing world. And I think it's supposed to be up to $1 trillion under the Paris commitments. So I think that website has listed 90 different climate funds that provide this kind of project funding. But, and you may know this, and you may be talking about it in different foresight groups, there's a lack of support mechanisms for Canadian project developers to access this climate finance. And there's no incentives for those developers to partner with Canadian clean tech firms. So I'd love to, in the Q&A, talk a little bit about how we can do that in other jurisdictions. They build consortia of big project developers who work with the small companies. And so I'll just very quickly, I think I'm out of time, but communicating value, as we talked about, how do you align interests between you as a startup and your investors? In November last year, 8 Canadian pension plans came out and said, we want consistent and complete ESG information so that we can strengthen our investment decision making. So it's something to think about, just maybe in the future as you grow, but something to think about putting in place now. And then the last thing is just climate governance for your board. There's a number of resources. There's us, CCLI, there's Chapter 0, which is more focused Europe and the UK. And there's Competent Boards, which is an education program for boards of directors around a number of ESG issues, not just climate. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Juvarya. Yeah, I think, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. If there's any message you take home, I think that's it. Thank you for spelling out the details of that for us. I just wanted to mention one of the main tools that I use to help companies, and Elise mentioned it earlier as well as Juvarya, is that B Corp is a really great way to figure out the how. How do we start implementing sustainability strategies into our business? B Corp is changing the way we're doing that. It's a community of leaders using business as a force for good, and businesses that are balancing purpose and profit. Some of the requirements are that you must have at least an 80 score on the impact assessment. And that's predominantly a lot of the work that I do, is help walk companies through that process. And you're legally required to consider all employees, customers, and suppliers, as well as community and environment in decision-making, which is very different than regular business. Why B Corp? Back to that millennial piece, you're winning over conscious consumers, as well as it's a really great way to have benchmarking and operationalizing cost savings, helping you know where you're at, and attracting and retaining quality talent, as I mentioned earlier when we talked about millennials. So I think that brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to pass it back to Stephen, and we can start the panel with questions. And I see there's a few in the chat. Hopefully we can get to some of those as well. Thanks so much.
Yeah, fantastic. I want to say thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the information. There was a lot in there, so I'm going to have to digest some of it to formulate my own questions. But also, I'd like to say a special thank you to Juvarya for going in and telling that absolutely terrifying story to boards and trying to get them to take action and be more open to the sort of changes that we need. So I think that's very important work, and I know that, on your screen, I think I'm maybe about that big. I'm about that big, and emotionally I'm that big too. I always think like the little guy and all the little companies here trying to sell into these big organizations. So it's really great that there's an organization approaching it from the top down and going into boards and saying, this is the changes you need to make. I did want to ask a couple questions of Elise. You came here, you've sat patiently, you did introduce Rise of Capital, but one of the things that small companies need, as Juvarya mentioned, is investment. And how do you look at those ESGs when your fund looks at a company? Are you looking for companies that have a broad commitment to ESGs, or kind of a deep commitment across the board to all of these things? Are you looking for B Corp companies and that kind of commitment, or are you looking for companies that are really narrowly focused on one issue and just say, you know, of the UN SDGs, water, that's the one. We all we do is we drive towards water quality, or we're all about, you know, GHG emissions and we do, you know, carbon negative technology, and that's our focus. And do you have a position on that when you look at companies?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot in that question. So, you know, so it's worth saying that like assessment and stewardship of environmental sustainability, but also social values and ethical governance practices, including transparency, is central to our investment thesis, to screening, but also to our overall value proposition to our investors. Because, you know, RISA, like also like a renewal funds or active impact, like we are intermediaries, we're funds that bring together both individual and institutional investors and then catalyze their motivations into how we deploy our capital into portfolios. So, you know, we have fiduciary duty to both maximize their returns, but also, you know, we've made the job more complicated for ourselves by saying that we're also going to deliver an environmental or social impact. So in order for us to meaningfully do that and communicate it, we have to align ourselves and invest in entrepreneurs whose business model is doing it, that, you know, it's not disclosing ESG risk factors is not a byproduct that they integrate into their business model. Rather, we invest in companies for which environmental or social impact is the business model. But the disclosure around, you know, ESG or, you know, SDG indicators, and you mentioned this before, like this is all big acronym country. We're a B Corp, we invest in the SDGs, and ESG is part of that. Like you could make a whole word salad out of just you know, acronyms. But so that is to say that we have to, you know, invest in entrepreneurs that want to dig into these details and do it regularly and meaningfully, both to derive extra value from their business model, but also to allow us to communicate that to our investors too. You know, so, and then also like as a B Corp, you know, we believe that diverse and inclusive and engaged teams deliver the strongest results. So we invest in founders that share those values. You know, the companies that we invest in have a clearly articulated vision and mission that enables both strong execution and internal governance. But we're also committed to being both a patient capital partner, but also a supportive partner to our investees, so that we can, you know, advocate within their cap table for, you know, ESG or sustainability furthering initiatives, and whether that is certifying as a B Corp or merely using the assessment to dive into those details. You know, we want to invest. So that is all to say that we want to invest in entrepreneurs that share that vision, that value proposition. But then once you establish that partnership, you can become stronger, and we can become, you know, advocates of change from within their cap table to help them kind of further things that they're already aligned on doing.
So if I could summarize in my own words, they don't have to necessarily have written or formalized structures for a lot of those things, but obviously you're looking for founders who are aligned with those. And luckily, all the companies at Foresight are clean tech companies, so I think they are broadly aligned with at least one of those three letters, and probably as a result aligned with the other ones a little bit, if not formally kind of in the articles or you know, in of their incorporation through the views of the founders.
Not always, and that is certainly not pervasive in the like RISA's portfolios, but it is becoming increasingly attractive. You know, because as more capital is driven to this space and reporting frameworks become more robust and also more common, you know, you have to make yourself stand out. So the more you can replicate metrics and you know, and show alignment with common approaches to impact communications and to measurement, the more attractive you are to a potential investor.
Right. And at least just to clarify, Clint asks, where do you guys like to invest? Pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B, Series C? How many emails do you want to get after this call?
Plenty. So Risa, we invest in BC headquartered companies. They have to be eligible business corporations, another acronym. But that means that we want a diverse portfolio because we're geographically focused. We want a diverse portfolio across stages. So we're one of the rare impact funds that will invest pre-seed, seed, and then support our companies all the way to follow on if they're achieving targets and we have kind of aligned growth projections. And so yeah, Risa is a really great space right now. We've just brought on our newest anchor investor, which is the TELUS Pollinator Fund for Good, which also speaks to the growth of the space in your traditional corporate world. The TELUS has launched a $100 million fund that's exclusively for businesses advancing the SDGs, both in Canada and in the US. And that is completely separate from their TELUS Ventures arm. So, if a company can bridge the gap between financial performance and sincere innovation, but also proving a social good, then all the better. And so we're coupled with TELUS, and they're investing in us because of the attractiveness of us supporting BC companies, and we're really excited to do that, both because through COVID, I think everything exists in a COVID context, but our recovery is outpacing the rest of the country, and we're also leveraging the provincial government's commitment to investing in clean tech companies, and that's including the tax incentives that we use within our funds. So yeah, emails are good. Emails are encouraged.
Okay. And really quickly, you mentioned yourselves and active impact and renewal funds. I think those are all BC based. You must have some friends in the impact investment space that are in Alberta and Saskatchewan, or at least look at investments. You sort of said your thesis was specifically BC based. Mm-hmm. What are the options out there? There's a few people on the line here from east of the Rockies. Who do they talk to?
So the renewal funds and the active impacts, they invest in They invest across North America. But I am here on behalf of Risa, and we look at BC-based companies. But there's lots of opportunity for partnerships across the country. And one of the initiatives that is relatively newly announced that Risa is really happy to be a part of is we're the fund manager partner for the Vancouver LC3. And so working with SFU Sustainable Cities, but and I mentioned that because when you say what are the opportunities across the country, between the Atmospheric Fund out of Ontario and then the other LC3 initiatives in metro centers across the country, there's tons of opportunity for investment, and that's both coming from the federal government, but also the intent of that is to crowd in private institutional capital.
Excellent. Thank you so much. There were some questions in the chat around B Corp, so I'll turn it back to Sara to answer that. I think somebody mentions that IRAP, of all people, had encouraged them or mentioned that maybe they shouldn't sign up for B Corp or go through that whole process. And what's kind of your advice? I mean, should you dive into that that structure right off the bat at the foundation of your company? Should you wait until you've kind of got sales and traction in the marketplace and you know that there's going to be value for your solutions long-term for society? When do you suggest people tackle that? And if it were coming from IRAP advice to not sign up for B Corp, why would they say that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm not sure about the IRAP piece. I've not heard of that in the history of helping companies do that. So to get B Corp certified. So I'm not sure. I'd love to look into that and find out more. It seems like it might have been suggested in the chat that it might be somebody's personal bias. I don't see any reason why a company wouldn't start doing it early and bake it into the DNA of the company. And the good news is that it's cheaper as your revenue gets higher. Your annual fees also get slightly higher, and it's easy. it's easier to start from the beginning and bake it into, like I said, the DNA of the company and the company culture. Just have a practice of measuring and monitoring your footprint. And I think, yeah, it begins the process of that retention and recruitment piece, as well as brand loyalty, as consumers are starting to poke holes and look for companies that are really walking the talk and really measuring what they're up to. And B Corp is a great way to do that. So I don't see any reason why you would wait. Excuse me. Yeah, it's good to get started and really bake it into the DNA of your company. And a lot of the pieces are around like putting in structures into your handbook, procedures and policies in place. And that's a lot of the work that you're doing at the onset anyway. And so if you're going to do it right the first time, it saves work down the road.
And what kind of is that work? What's that time commitment? Because I think that's, time is the one precious resource that nobody here has enough of. What does that look like? I mean, either just filling out the assessment or actually implementing some of the recommendations to get to that 80 points out of 200, or just seeing where they're at. What does that kind of take?
Yeah, I love this question because that's essentially where I've built my consulting services around. Doing the certification process is quite cumbersome. I mean, an organization could do it on its own, and it does take a lot of work. And so what I've done is I've built a back-end spreadsheet, and I know where I can pull a lot of those numbers from. And so my process is such that like I streamline it and make it really easy for you. I think in 3 months, which is typically the longest it takes for that first chunk to get you your baseline. That's where I'm collecting a lot of your data to see where I can just pull and calculate existing a score from what you have existing. And my job is really to like build the proof and build all the numbers so that you can continue to do your work. And then depending on how fast you can get that to me and how much of a gap there is between your baseline score and an 80, which is what I said you needed to get to become B Corp certified, then that's where the time can be variable. And it really depends on, some clients want the Cadillac version where I come in and help write these policies and procedures and they just okay them or approve the drafts. And then we get them to an 80. And then on the B Corp side, it takes them a little bit of time to then go through the approval. Right now, they're making some commitments to hiring more people. The backlog's been up to 5 months, and I think they're hiring 50% more evaluators. So it right now might take 9 months for the whole process, but depending on how fast you can get me the information, my job is to expedite that and make it as easy as possible on you, because I want you to do your job. And I just want to help you get B Corp certified so you can measure what matters.
Absolutely. Always important to focus on the impact. Juvarya, now you get the pleasure in the Canada Climate Law Initiative of going into those boards and trying to motivate them to make changes on this. Do you see them, what drivers are they responding to? Is it the terrifying statistics that you provide? Is it because it's part of their mission statement and they want to get financing from BlackRock? What are those drivers? Is it the regulatory drivers that are forcing them to look at some of these issues? And do you find them more leaning on the environmental, social, and governance? There's about 3 questions in one.
All of the above is the short answer. I mean, I'll tell you what I tell people about why I took the role. I think that we're talking about a behavior change program, right? A sustainability. It's a lot about how you're changing behavior, what tools are you using, how do you understand people's mental models, and then kind of expose all of our assumptions and really get at how to make that decision. And I think it's the same in this case. And as previously I was working with clean tech entrepreneurs or other, green building sector, and it's about making that business case because I really think you want to lead with the opportunity. But then you can close with a good, healthy dose of fear. The challenge is there is litigation now around the world. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to go into all the details, but we track it and it is on our website. And there was a successful litigation in Nigeria recently against one of the oil companies there. And there is litigation from investor groups who are saying, for instance, to their pension funds, this happened in Australia, that, you know, you're exposing my pension to risk because you haven't properly accounted for climate risk. So there's an increasing body around this. I think you can go to climate-laws.org and it lists all of these. In Canada, we haven't had any litigation yet. But if you look at, you know, the statutes that were on that slide, it's like the current law is clear that climate change is a responsibility. And if we get to mandatory disclosure, it will just be kind of the underline on that. So what is motivating the boards? We do speak to a lot of pension funds. So I think, you know, pension funds are long-term investors. And so this is definitely something that's very important to them, because climate risks, we don't know how to quantify them. And we do still know that the worst impacts will be in slightly more of the longer term, even though we're seeing some in the short term. So pension funds are really interested. In terms of the sectors that I think, EY do a climate risk barometer, which shows how many companies are disclosing climate risk under the TCFD framework. And you can see there are some sectors that are doing, you know, are really ahead of the curve, I think, because that they're seeing that this is a risk, risk to their supply chains. And then there are some that are doing it because there's a risk that they will be first in line required to do so. So a lot of financial services, credit unions, banks need to understand where the risk is in their portfolio. But then I really think it's for everyone. But how do we talk about it? I say, you know, opportunity is more interesting to talk about. And although fear is a great motivator.
Fantastic. And what I liked about what you said, there was a list of companies that have set their net zero goals or have identified that this is of interest to them. And I think there was a previous question, somebody saying, who in the oil and gas sector has made these sorts of commitments? So that's one of those things where you said there's market opportunity. You can look and say, these are the companies that are driving towards this. They're more likely to adopt practices or be early adopters of technology. Would that be fair? And are there any other tools where you can find companies that have made these commitments, or is that TCFD list the best one published by Ernst & Young?
Ernst & Young has their list. CPA Canada has a list it's not a list, but it is an analysis of Canadian companies and what they're doing by sector. So a couple of things in response to that question, I had said, I think in oil and gas, there is a real focus on social license to operate. And so in terms of reporting, there's certainly a focus on sustainability in the social sense, in the stakeholder engagement sense. And I'm sure sort of in terms of reducing emissions as well, there is a focus on innovation. I think these things are easier to talk about. TCFD says that the climate risk should be part of your financial statements. All of these disclosures belong alongside your financial statements. I don't think I'd say that we're there. I think that they're usually separate sustainability reports, maybe not just in oil and gas, but, you know, across a lot of corporate sector. I wish I had the data, I don't. But one interesting thing I was talking about with a couple of our experts on the phone earlier today was that if you look at, I think it's Total, Shell, and BP. So these are organizations that are certainly integrating climate risk and diversifying. They're becoming, you know, investing in renewable energy. Whereas Exxon and Chevron, I think, were just talking about a merger. Like there's not enough value there and they haven't diversified. So, you know, what do you take away from that kind of what's happening in terms of these companies and their long-term resilience? And then there was one final point I was going to make, but I think, you know, I think I'll leave it there if I answered the question.
I think you did. And I will grant I ask sometimes challenging multi-part questions. So I'll try to keep them a little bit shorter. Sara, you shared those wonderful stats from Bob Willard on the potential savings around implementing ESGs. Any of the companies here will only get to contribute a portion of that. Or is there a way that they can use that tool as part of a bigger program to sort of sell in or motivate their customers to start walking down the path? You know, while they themselves are adopting, you know, the people on this call might be adopting ESGs, we want the customers adopting those as well, or taking steps toward implementing those actions. Is that?
Well, the graph was just internal facing. It's called the Sustainability Advantage, and my mentor who does the work his name is Bob Willard, and yeah, you can find his calculator online. And essentially it's internal facing, so not necessarily for customers or consumers, yet a good portion of, you can see where you'll see cost savings is in how you interact with your customers and consumers, you know, with brand loyalty, as well as like that retention and recruitment piece, and then the cost savings from energy and waste and water that you'll have when you invest in a sustainability strategy. It's over a longer term, it's over 3 to 5 years. And that investment back into your company is 51 to 81%, as I mentioned, on your bottom line over that duration. And then I guess the last piece is that you'll see cost savings on risk mitigation. And it can be overwhelming to look at first sight, and we didn't have enough time to go into detail. So I encourage you, the point I really just wanted to drive home is that it's not only the right thing to do, and not only are investors looking through the lens of ESG, not only is it a matter of if but rather a matter of when. It's also has the opportunity to make and save you money. So that's another case for the earlier answer to your question, Stephen, is start now and get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I guess I was more looking at, you know, oftentimes we get, or in small businesses, people become very focused on the short-term business case of, you know, if you put in a heat recovery ventilator, was that talked about? You know, the 75%, somebody brought that up today. If you put in a heat recovery ventilator, there you go, Juvarya brought it up. You put in a heat pump and a heat recovery ventilator, thank you for your good work at the City of Vancouver for supporting those technology innovations. You're going to save a few bucks, and that's the business case for the heat pump and heat recovery ventilator. But if you start to take actions along that road of meeting, you know, setting ESG goals and meeting them and kind of incorporating that in your business, you'll see indirect benefits. You'll see a benefit more than just the savings of that heat pump. You sort of mentioned some of the indirect savings in terms of, you know, staff morale and staff turnover and those things. And so how can we fold in, or can you fold in some of those stats that are great from Bob Willard into the way that Foresight talks about the opportunity, right? It's not just the opportunity of using that heat pump. It's all the benefits that come with acting in these ways. And how can individual companies fold that storytelling into what they talk about, I guess. And do you sort of see people trying to do that, or is it really focused on, I'll just mind my own actions and hope that that passively influences the rest of the world?
Yeah, I'm not sure. There's a question for Juvarya and I, but I'll just say a comment and then maybe pass it to Juvarya if she has anything else to add. But I think it's the storytelling aspect is important, but more important than that is really what's underneath of it. And I think gone are the days where greenwashing is acceptable and you can just say we've got a recycling program and call it a day. You know, I think you're really needing robust and accurate ways to measure and monitor your footprint, and with ESG looking at what your risks are as the climate begins to warm, and these real challenges impact these companies. From an insurance perspective, those are the risks. That's that risk column that we're looking at in Bob Willard's spreadsheet. So I think there are companies who are doing great storytelling. I do think it's important. And I think what's even more important is that you stop and take a look at what your actual footprint is, and you engage with tools. That's why I'm such a big fan of B Corp, because it offers a really great way to like get your affairs in order and figure out what your footprints are around waste, water, customers, governance, all those pieces, and then you can from there have endless amounts of material to report out to the world and tell that story of the good work that you're doing and how you're using business as a force for good.
Excellent. Juvarya, did you have anything else to sort of add to that on that market opportunity piece of aligning your storytelling with broader trends?
Oh, on the storytelling side, maybe I'll come back to, but I did notice in the comments that someone was talking about offsets. And I think that is definitely a way to, as they said in the comments, monetize some of the indirect benefits. Someone else said in the comments that it can be horrendous to administer that. So I think, it would be interesting, to discuss how do we aggregate. We were talking about sort of climate finance earlier. How do we work together to access the however many trillions the EU has for green solutions? And how do we work together to monetize those benefits like carbon offsets? I think that would be very interesting. I don't know how we can tell a story that would enable us as a sector to do that, but I think that would be very interesting. And yeah, I won't add anything. I think, Sara, you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, in terms of, it looks like the conversation is they're using blockchain to fractionalize carbon offsets. I know that there's a few aggregators operating in Alberta, like Radical, that have looked at the ag sector. And I know actually in our current cohort, there's two different companies looking at that very problem. One of them is Carbon Block, and the other one is Cascadia Carbon, isn't it, Tony? So, so we do have people looking at those problems and those challenges. And if you'd like to speak more with them on what their approach is, or give them any sort of advice or thoughts from your viewpoint, happy to connect you with them. Or maybe they want to say something right now.
Well, it's good to know you guys set up a little bit of friendly competition in the Foresight Accelerator.
Well, and in a lot of these markets, there's it's big enough that you can have multiple players. I always like to say if there's a Coke, there's room for a Pepsi.
It's different,
right?
Yeah, and we don't know what we're going to get, but we'll see.
A lot of it comes down to the specific market. Like I mentioned, Radical has done a very good job in the ag sector with measurement and verification around soil sequestration. But there's still all the industrial emitters out there. There's still all the small other activities that need good measurement and verification and need something that can get into the voluntary markets. So it's not going to be, I don't think, one solution fits all the possible target applications. I could be wrong. Anybody else have an opinion on that?
I think blockchain is about as good of a solution as we have for the fractionalization and the trustless architecture around it for actually monetizing these co-benefits with carbon offsets. But I think at the end of the day, there's something that doesn't quite add up when it comes to like efficiency offsets and then actual carbon negative offsets, because there aren't enough carbon negative offsets. That's why we're in this whole mess to start with. If we had enough carbon offsets, we wouldn't have climate change. So there's differences between like types of carbon offsets. I think blockchain is really valuable for differentiating that and determining which co-benefits are actually like evaluating those different co-benefits.
Absolutely. Thank you. You've obviously looked at the problem a little bit more than at least I have. There was some questions around green bonds, and Elise, you're on that sort of money flowing into the industry side of things, and there's a question around the view that possibly there's actually more capital, there's more money in these green bonds, there's more investment than there are potential projects, or there's a challenge of getting the money from that, those investment pools into actual projects. Do you agree that that's the case, or do you see that as a challenge?
I mean, from my perspective on the matter is less on the project delivery side, more on how to cultivate like investor pools into those products. But the demand is huge. The regulatory environment makes it somewhat difficult, where for a green bond, most of them are predicated on investing in real assets. So more on the infrastructure side, like that's where CoPower is investing, a new one that was recently launched, that I'm not a part of other than an investor, like just as an individual, but RE Royalties is doing a lot of work in that space. But there is speaking to a firm just last week that wants to link a green bond product to carbon offsets and in forestry products and in conservation spaces. So I think that we're poised for a lot of innovation on that. And I would love, RISA to have our feet in that pool too. But we have a few too many things on the go right now to really jump into that area, but I'm certainly encouraged by the competition in that space and definitely the demand side. There is so much demand from retail investors in particular. I mean, that's one of the things that brought me over to RISA from where I was at Renewal Funds prior was, how do we create products that are accessible to normal people? Because there is so much motivation behind, just retail investor, normal households to move their assets from things that are opaque and largely, weighted in the fossil fuel sector towards things that they actually care about. And that's, one of the things that drives me every day in the impact investing space is we're finally reaching an inflection point of breaking that cycle where people have no idea where their assets are invested, but they know where they're driving change with their philanthropic dollars. Like they give to charities that are, conserving natural spaces, but their mortgage is invested in fossil fuel infrastructure. Like we're getting to a place where that dynamic is being illuminated. And we're getting now to the on the product side where financial institutions are actually creating products to let people not just know and gripe about it, but actually do something about it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that's a great view. And so the takeaway for me would be get to TRL9 and there'll be tons of money for your projects. All you got to do is commercialize that first unit. And then it's all made in the shade, as they say. Juvarya, you brought up an interesting point around some of the funds that were available for global development. I think you used nice words like, was it half a trillion or a whole trillion? Like nice big numbers, lots of zeros. Shouldn't say 3 trillion. And that we don't have any mechanisms to support accessing those funds in Canada. Can you dive into that? Because I always want to get my greedy little mitts on $500 billion or even just a little bit of it, just 1%. I'm here to share.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more? Do other countries have mechanisms that are available to access that or encourage participation in those funds, or what sort of consortia have accessed those funds?
Yes, and I brought it up and I know a little bit about it because there's Canada, what's it called? The Canada Corporation is currently looking at this and what their role could be in helping aggregate around this. But if you look at sort of the Nordic countries, Nordic countries, Denmark, Holland, they do this really good job. They have I think it's called, it might just be called CLEAN, but it's a consortium of made up of Ramboll and Grundfos. So these are their bigger engineering companies, the project companies, but it's also coordinated with the clean tech companies. And so they coordinate when they're bidding for these international development projects, and the whole kind of value chain is Nordic in that sense. So in Canada, we might have the WSPs of the world and the Stantec's going, but I don't think that they have a mechanism to work with everybody on this call. And so what is that consortium? How do we build that relationship? What's the value then to the project developers or integrators to seek out Canadian innovation rather than just kind of working with who they've always worked with? So I think, you know, there's something there. I don't have an answer, but I think you know, when I joined VEC 10 years ago, we were talking about this, and we're kind of still talking about it. I talked to the climate finance people at Global Affairs last week to just sort of say, what do you think? What is happening? And they have, you know, a number of trade commissioners who are dedicated to talking about climate finance. They have a tool on their website where you can see what the funds are, but they're just not accessible because of the bureaucracy and the size and scale of the projects for individual clean tech companies to participate in. So I feel that there is some solution there, and it's, you know, we could model it on what's happening in Europe, I think, very easily. Just need to talk to some people who've designed the programs there. I think, for instance, we have our commitment just before COP21 was $2.5 billion just from Canada as part of these, you know, technology to developing countries. But there was a report by Engineers Without Borders that broke it down and said why we're not able to really participate fully in that.
Okay. And if there are any stipulations around that $2.5 billion, that some part of it has to use Canadian technology or Canadian companies, wouldn't have anything about using Canadian small companies. It is kind of one
These are
part of the
good
challenge
questions.
there. And
These are
there's
good questions.
yeah, and structural challenges, I think, around big EPCs like Stantec and WSP working with small innovators is certainly something I've heard as a challenge. You know, they want really big, well-known. For them, something innovative is it's only been done for the last 20 years, right?
Yeah, risk averse.
Yeah, so certainly some challenges there, but interesting, an opportunity to access some international funding and international projects, because certainly international markets, I'm a big fan of exporting the technology we develop here. That's how we have the global impact that I think we want to have. So I think we've only got a few minutes left, and I would like to ask you know, each of the panelists sort of, if there was an action, if there's something you would like the companies on the call to do, Elise, towards ESGs, what would it be?
I think, you know, without knowing too many specifics about the companies that we're sharing the space with, I would say, like, just by nature of being in the clean tech space, you are working towards the E, but don't neglect the S or the G, especially in a hyper-competitive space like clean tech. You know, a competitive advantage that you can hopefully easily integrate is just looking at like the diversity of your board, the gender breakdown of your leadership team. And if it's not exactly where you think it needs to be, being explicit about that and making intentions to, you know, to take like a reconciliation lens to your business model and your governance. Like, how are you engaging with the communities around your business, and just trying to think about those factors while so much of your business is predicated on the E, and don't lose that for certainly, but you can build in a competitive analysis or advantage by looking at the other letters.
Thank you very much. I thought that was a fantastic answer. Sara, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that was hard to beat. Elise really just nailed it home. I think yeah, I think the time is now, and these things are really important to be taking a closer look at and figure out how your company can stand for these pieces. So nothing really additional to add. Thank you.
No problem at all. Juvarya, anything you want to see these companies do that make your life easier, that make your work at the Canada Climate Law Initiative easier, that you just generally...
Well, my job is to deliver 250 presentations working with our experts. So building on what Elise said, if you're looking at sort of the governance piece, there are a couple of practical steps. You know, what tools are you using for decision making? Do you have an internal price on carbon that you use to assess projects, your own operations? Do you have ESG expertise on the board? Probably with all of you, but you know, what, and not just ESG, you know, what is your sort of selection process for ensuring there is that competence on the board? And then how are you educating and keeping yourself up to date? So for that, I would offer one of our 250 pro bono presentations. We have 70 experts in lots of different sectors with lots of different backgrounds and expertise. It's interesting, we were talking about agriculture. We've got someone who's working on that, you know, how do you monetize carbon sequestration with the farmers? So working, so I wrote down the name of the company and I will maybe connect, but we offer these presentations to boards, whether it's your own or you sit on other boards. You know, I'd love to hear from people.
Thank you very much. So free, they will come out and talk to your boards for free to educate them on these things. And one of the things that I would love to see from all the Foresight companies is that you have a clear impact metric, either if you're pre-commercial, what it is you intend to do, what is going to be the way that you're going to measure your impact, and your technology will do this thing in the world. And as well as you list your TAM, that total addressable market, you say, if everybody adopted my technology, this could have an impact of 1 billion tons of GHGs or 1 billion liters of clean water, or whatever that metric that you're choosing is. I think it would be so wonderful and important, both for seeing the impact yourselves and communicating it internally, as Sara so nicely articulated. But once you have those metrics, you can communicate them externally. You can communicate them to Elise and say, this is why you need to invest in my company, and all the other renewable funds and active impact and all those green bonds. This is why you need to be part of that project. So getting a clear, crisp metric that you can actually account on, like every unit I sell, I'm going to save 5 kilograms of CO2. So all I need to do is sell 150 million units to get my 1 billion ton target, or whatever the numbers work out to be. But that would be something I think would be great and would definitely align with all of the things we talked about today. With that, I think we're at the end of time. So I will say thank you. I appreciate everybody's participation in the chat. I love to see you guys interacting with each other. I love that you come out here and respect the time that these experts have taken to share some of their knowledge with you on these topics. And it is so important that we continue to grow and align with some of the big trends that are happening and driving the change that we want to see. So thank you again to our panelists, Sara, Elise, and Juvarya. Thank you to all the Foresight companies. Continue doing the great work you're doing. And I hope you have a great day.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks,
Thank
Tony.
you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Stephen.
Bye,
Thanks,
guys.
Elise. Thanks, Jabaria. Bye-bye.
Bye.